He was told he was too quiet, too poor, and too invisible to ever amount to anything. But when John Whitecloud's mind cracked the code no one else could solve, the world had no choice but to listen. What they didn't know was that the quiet orphan was destined to revolutionize the future, and no one would ever doubt his brilliance again. The small-town school in Oklahoma stood quietly amidst the ancient oak trees, its worn exterior a reflection of the years it had stood, weathering countless storms. Inside, the walls were lined with old posters, and the classrooms, though cozy, held a heavy sense of tradition. Despite the old desks and fading chalkboards, the air inside was filled with the energy of young minds, each hoping that education would be their escape from the struggles they faced at home. But for John Whitecloud, this hope seemed distant. At 13, John was an orphan, living with his aunt and cousins after the death of his parents in a tragic accident. His dark, piercing eyes were often downcast, his thoughts consumed by the world he could never quite escape. His clothes, hand-me-downs, were too big and worn out. But it wasn't just his appearance that set him apart. It was the intellect he carried within, an intellect that none of his classmates, teachers, or even family members understood. John's mind was a constant whirlwind of numbers and patterns. He would sit in the back of the class, his head buried in books no one else could read, his thoughts far away from the reality of the schoolyard mockery and the constant teasing from his cousins. At school, John was seen as quiet, shy, and awkward. His peers called him Professor Nobody, a name meant to mock him, but it only deepened his isolation. The only person who seemed to understand him was Miss Martha Pierce, his aunt's retired foster care worker. She had taken him in after his parents' death and became a quiet ally in his struggle. Miss Martha wasn't just his guardian. She was his supporter, the one person who saw beyond the surface. Despite her role as the housekeeper, she secretly kept a collection of math and physics books just for him. She knew John had a gift, but the world around him didn't see it. At school, John's teacher, Mrs. Dolores Grant, was another obstacle in his path. In her late 50s, she had a reputation for strict discipline and an unwavering belief in following the rules. Mrs. Grant believed that every student should follow her lead, and her eyes never lingered on John for too long. She dismissed him as lazy and unmotivated simply because he didn't fit the mold of the loud, outgoing students she favored. What Mrs. Grant didn't know was that John wasn't lazy. He was quietly brilliant, solving equations and understanding concepts that even she struggled with. One day, as the students were settling into their seats, Mrs. Grant stood at the front of the class, writing equations on the board. She paused, her gaze sweeping over the room before it landed on John, sitting at the back in his usual seat. The other students, including Peter and Clyde, John's older cousins, began to whisper among themselves, their laughter barely concealed. "John," Mrs. Grant said sharply, her voice slicing through the silence. "Come to the board and solve this equation." John hesitated. The last thing he wanted was to be the center of attention. He could feel his heart race, his palms sweat, but he stood up, his legs trembling as he walked to the front. He didn't look at anyone, keeping his focus solely on the board. Mrs. Grant had written a complex quadratic equation, one that even she sometimes struggled to teach properly. The students snickered behind him. They knew John was quiet, they knew he had never spoken up in class, and they expected him to fail. Peter and Clyde's mocking words echoed in his mind, calling him Professor Nobody and laughing at his love for books. It all felt like too much. But as he stood in front of the chalkboard, his mind went quiet. The numbers, the symbols, the patterns, they all clicked. He could see the solution clearly, hidden beneath the chaos. The equations weren't just lines and symbols. They were stories waiting to be told. He picked up the chalk, his hand still shaking, but his mind was calm now. He wrote the first steps carefully, then the next, his mind racing through the math with ease. The equation, once complicated and unsolvable in the eyes of his classmates, began to unravel itself under his touch. He could hear the whispers behind him, but they faded as his focus sharpened. The room was silent as John continued to work through the problem. Ms. Grant, standing just behind him, watched with a mix of disbelief and irritation. She didn't believe it was possible. How could this quiet boy, the one she dismissed as lazy, be solving something beyond her comprehension? When John finished, he turned to face the class. His hands were trembling slightly, but there was no fear in his eyes. He had done it. "The solution is correct," he said quietly, his voice soft but certain. "The roots of the equation are x equals 5 and x equals -3. The room went still. Mrs. Grant looked at the board, her mouth slightly agape, and then quickly checked her own notes. The solution was right. John had done it. And for the first time, she was speechless. For a brief moment, the tension in the room hung thick, like the calm before a storm. The students stared at John, stunned. But then, Ms. Grant broke the silence. She said coldly, her voice returning to its usual sternness, "Sit down." The days following his moment at the chalkboard felt like a blur. John Whitecloud tried to settle back into his usual routine at school, but everything had changed. Or maybe it hadn't. The looks he received from his classmates were different now. Some stared at him with respect, some with bewilderment, but it was hard to ignore that his brief moment of brilliance hadn't won him the admiration he thought it would. The next day, in Mrs. Grant's class, the atmosphere was heavier. The teacher didn't look at John the same way anymore. She seemed even more dismissive, as if his performance had somehow insulted her authority. When she handed back the homework, she barely acknowledged him. There was no praise, no recognition for his accuracy, just a cold nod and a few words about not disturbing the class. But the real test came when John answered the next question in class correctly, and this time, it wasn't just about the equation, it was about his place in the class. Mrs. Grant, unwilling to admit her error, accused John of being lucky, of copying from someone else's paper. She claimed that his answer had to be a fluke, and that no one could possibly solve such a problem on their own. The class erupted into laughter. John stood there, his heart sinking. He knew the truth. He knew that he wasn't lucky. He had solved it with the same ease he had solved equations for as long as he could remember. But in that moment, he was alone, surrounded by mocking faces and doubt. The laughter felt like a sharp slap. He had spent so long in the shadows, avoiding attention, and now, when he finally dared to step forward, he was shoved back into the dark. The worst part was that, despite the correct answer on the board, despite the silence that followed, he couldn't prove himself. His classmates didn't understand, and Mrs. Grant would never see him for what he was. Instead of feeling vindicated, he felt small again. When he got home that evening, his cousins Peter and Clyde were there, waiting for him. They were already laughing, mocking him before he even entered the room. "What's up, Professor Nobody?" Peter jeered. "Got another equation you want to solve for us? Maybe one that's too hard for the rest of us to understand." Clyde chimed in with a mocking grin. "Yeah, maybe you can solve the equation of how we're gonna get you to shut up and stop showing off." John's stomach churned. His cousin's words echoed in his mind. He had always known they didn't understand him, but today felt different. The world outside was hostile, and even though he had proven something to himself, it felt like it wasn't enough. No one believed in him. They had mocked his dreams, and in their eyes, he was still that quiet, unimportant kid. But as he sat at the kitchen table, pushing his food around with a fork, a familiar voice broke through the storm in his mind. Miss Martha. She had been his unwavering supporter, the one person who could see the flicker of brilliance in him when no one else would. Her gentle yet firm voice cut through his thoughts. "John, don't let them steal your fire," she said softly, placing a hand on his shoulder. "People are afraid of what they don't understand. They'll mock you because they don't know how to deal with someone like you." John looked up at her, eyes heavy with doubt. "I don't think I can take it anymore, Ms. Martha. They don't care about me. I don't fit in, No matter what I do, it feels like I'll never be enough. Miss Martha squeezed his shoulder, her eyes filled with the kind of wisdom only someone who had seen the harshness of the world could possess. John, you are enough. They'll never see it until you show them, not with your words, but with what you can do. And when they see that, they'll have no choice but to believe in you. She continued, there's an entrance exam coming up for a special program. It's a tough one, but you can do it. Prove to yourself that you belong. Not for them, for you. For the first time in days, John felt a flicker of hope. The exam was known for being one of the most challenging in the area, filled with advanced physics, calculus, and logic puzzles that stumped even the brightest minds. The thought of it scared him, but it also called to him. He had always been afraid of failing, afraid of not measuring up to the world's expectations. But maybe this exam was his chance to finally prove his worth. John agreed to take the test, but on his own terms. No shortcuts, no cheating. He would rely only on his own abilities, just as he always had. The exam wasn't just about answering questions. It was about showing the world that he wasn't invisible, that his talents had real value. When the day of the exam arrived, John sat at the desk, the weight of his doubts and the memories of mockery still heavy on his chest. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and cleared his mind. As the test began, his hands moved across the paper, solving equations, unraveling the complexities of physics and math that had always come to him naturally. As the hours ticked by, the pain of the past seemed to fade, replaced by the sheer joy of using his mind to solve problems. The doubts that had lingered in the back of his mind no longer held power over him. He was no longer the quiet boy in the back of the class. He was John Martin Whitecloud, a boy with a mind unlike any other. And this exam was just the beginning of his journey. When he finished, he walked out of the room not with arrogance, but with peace. Whatever the outcome, he knew he had given it his all. And that was enough. The results for the entrance exam came faster than John had expected, but when he saw them, it felt like a dream. The moment the test scores were announced, his heart raced in his chest. Not only had he passed, but he had aced the exam, scoring among the highest in the state. The school quickly made the results public, and suddenly, the boy who had always been in the back of the class, ignored and ridiculed, was now at the center of it all. John sat there, stunned, as whispers filled the air around him. Students looked at him with awe, some in disbelief. Ms. Grant, the teacher who had belittled him, stood stiffly at the front, visibly uncomfortable. She had mocked his brilliance just weeks ago, calling him lazy, and now she had to acknowledge that John was not only competent, but had proven to be one of the brightest students the school had ever seen. The entire classroom seemed to hold its breath. John's classmates, who had once snickered at his quiet demeanor, now stared at him with newfound respect. Even Peter and Clyde, his cousins who had spent so much time making him feel inferior, were stunned into silence. The world John had known had suddenly turned upside down. He wasn't invisible anymore. Ms. Grant, however, couldn't let go of her pride. She stood in front of the class, trying to regain control. "Well, this is proof that hard work and discipline can bring results," she muttered as though trying to take credit for John's success. "I always knew that a little discipline could make a big difference." But no one was fooled. The students whispered among themselves, exchanging looks that said it all. It wasn't discipline that had helped John. It was his intellect, his hard work, and his passion for learning. Ms. Grant's own shortcomings as a teacher were now impossible to ignore. As the day went on, John sat quietly in the classroom, but his mind was racing. He had finally shown the world his true potential, but it was still hard to believe. His thoughts kept circling back to the mockery, the isolation, the way Ms. Grant had tried to make him feel small. And yet now he had proven her wrong. At home, when John walked in after school, the mocking wasn't over. Peter and Clyde were waiting for him. They had already heard the news about the exam results, and their arrogant grins had quickly turned to nervous glances. You actually did it, huh? Peter said, trying to sound casual. But there was no hiding the surprise in his voice. Clyde, still unsure of how to react, finally broke the silence. Yeah, man. Look, we were wrong about you. You're not like some nerd after all. John didn't flinch at their words. He had already grown beyond their mockery. He had long since stopped seeking their approval. It's okay, John said simply, walking past them. I've got other things to focus on now. He didn't need their validation anymore. He had earned his place on his own. Later that evening, as he sat in his room, staring at the test results, his phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize. Curious, he answered. Hello, is this John Whitecloud? A voice asked, professional but warm. This is John. Hi, John. My name is Derek Hamilton, and I'm with Speedway Motors. We've seen your exam results, and we'd like to offer you a chance to join our training program. John was taken aback. Speedway Motors was a well-known local company that focused on automobile innovation. Derek continued, we specialize in both automotive engineering and cutting-edge technology, and we believe you could be a great fit. We'd like to train you in automotive design and mechanics. We also know how much you value your education, so we're offering to support your academic journey while you're with us. You'll have flexible hours to continue your studies in mathematics and physics, subjects we believe you're deeply passionate about. John's heart soared. This was everything he had ever wanted. A chance to learn, to grow, and to apply his mind to something he loved. More than that, it was an opportunity to finally be seen for who he really was. He didn't hesitate. I'd love to take the opportunity, he said, his voice steady. Great, Derek replied enthusiastically. We'll get everything set up for you, and you'll start your first day next week. John's mind raced with the possibilities. He had always felt isolated, trapped in a life where his talents were hidden, misunderstood. But now, he had a real chance to prove himself, to be a part of something that could shape the future of engineering. For the first time in a long while, John felt like he had control over his future. This wasn't about surviving anymore. It was about thriving. As he sat in his room later that night, John thought about Ms. Martha. It was because of her belief in him, her encouragement, that he had even taken the first step. Without her, he would have never dared to challenge the world that had always dismissed him. He promised himself that he would make her proud by becoming the engineer, the innovator, and the man he had always known he could be. As the months passed after John started his training at Speedway Motors, his world shifted in ways he had never imagined. The knowledge he had cultivated in the shadows, mathematics, physics, and the intricate workings of automobiles, began to meld together seamlessly. John quickly became a key asset to the company, applying his sharp mind and problem-solving skills to engine design, mechanical innovations, and the improvement of existing systems. It wasn't long before Speedway Motors recognized his talent and offered him a permanent position as a junior engineer. But even with this success, John didn't stop. He was determined to complete his academic journey, knowing that the deeper understanding he craved could only be achieved through formal education. Speedway Motors supported his ambition, offering him flexible hours to continue his studies at a local university. John pursued a degree in engineering, all while applying his newfound knowledge directly in the field. Years passed, and John's life transformed. He had gone from a boy who felt invisible to a young man recognized for his intelligence, hard work, and passion for engineering. He had found his place in the world, not only as an engineer, but as someone who could make a real impact. John's name began to spread beyond the walls of Speedway Motors. He was invited to industry conferences, to speak at universities, and to collaborate on projects that would shape the future of automobiles. But John knew that his success wasn't just for him. He had been given opportunities, and now it was his turn to give back. Reflecting on the struggles he faced growing up, he knew how important it was for young minds from difficult backgrounds to have the same chances he did. That's when the idea came to him. He would pay it forward by helping others who were like him. Students who had the talent but not the resources to succeed. With the support of Speedway Motors, John launched a mentorship program focused on underprivileged youth interested in engineering and automotive mechanics. John worked closely with the company to provide hands-on experience, making sure these students learn not only theory but practical skills that would give them an edge in the competitive field of engineering. For Ms. Martha, she was very old. John placed him on a premium health insurance and ensured she aged gracefully. He also forgave him aunt and cousins, and they all united in love. If his story inspired you, don't let doubt hold you back. Like, subscribe, and share this video. Let's celebrate the power of perseverance and genius, no matter where it comes from. Keep following to see more incredible stories that challenge the world's expectations.